We begin. Pitch black. A rumbling of engines, of several Toyota chassis, in step with camels, and music wade through the Wadi Hanifa, processioning through the black of the night, here in Riyadh. Thick black clouds storm like a stampede of foreboding elephants somewhere in Kerala and in Riyadh. A pitch black tank flashes like lightning captured in an aquarium somewhere in the Amazon and in Riyadh. In a pitch black night, stars shimmer green behind night vision goggles in Kabul and in Riyadh. A crinkly tapestry of tattered plastic sheets form a world map where the sea is not blue but black, the black of the abyss that Edward Lisson wrote about, first seen in Limpopo, then in Riyadh. The black pupil of the cosmic eye dilates as it observes us from the dark matter of the universe here in Riyadh. The black pupil of our eye dilates as we experience the inner workings of our neural universe here in Riyadh. These are only a few references to the processions of dark matter in this edition of the Diriyah Biennale. Here today, we're in a satellite site orbiting the Biennale in the studio of another artist who has been working with black since he started making art. Muhannad, Shono. A round of applause for Muhannad. Welcome to Unpacking the Studio. This is a series that we started with the Diriyah Biennale 2026 as artist conversations that explore a redefinition of the artist studio in the 21st century. Rather than a site of solitary production, the series approaches each studio as a dynamic constellation of spaces, infrastructures, and situated knowledges that shape artistic practice today. We're already aware that the teleology of art making has shifted from making art in the studio and then exhibiting it in an exhibition space, because a lot of times the artwork only materializes and manifests in the exhibition when it comes to site-specific installations. We've got several of those in this edition of the Biennale. We're also already aware that in the 20th century, the studio became a factory of Andy Warhol. It became a space for conversations and meetings in Ashkal Alwan in Beirut. It became a studio inside a home during COVID. This series is inspired by several practices of contemporary artists today, but it's also inspired by Sarai's City Studio project that took place in Delhi between 2010 and 2013. It's also inspired by Walter Benjamin's Unpacking My Library, the series where he talks about basically the world within worlds of libraries. And what does it mean when you open a book or when you stack them one next to each other? In this series, we look at artist studios as lived environments where thinking and making are continuously arranged, disrupted, and refigured. We're acutely aware of how cities are undergoing enormous transformation today, and artist studios create new maps of changing cities. To give an example, depending on an artist's project, you might have a welder working with a dancer, working with a print fabricator, working with a plastic kind of merchant, all of whom would rarely ever meet together except because of the artist's project. So that creates a constellation of different sites, infrastructures, knowledges, only because artists bring the weirdest questions together. We, in the series at the Biennale, have had the studio as an interface, the studio as a hive with Abdulaziz, the studio as an accordion book by Two Collective, the studio as a sanctuary by Marwa. Here, in today's session, we're looking at Shono Studio as a collider. Why a collider? Because according to Shono, And this is something that we come up with each artist that we speak with. Why collider? Because he sees his practice of one where particles not only collide with one another, but also the very systems that observe them. I found it very compelling because it's also a collider where, or a studio as collider where the granular and the cosmic both seem to be operating together. I'm not sure how many of you have had a chance to see many of Muhannad's projects, but if you spend time in his studio, you will find the granular and the cosmic often together, paired together in all kinds of strange ways and configurations. Today we're going to talk about Shono's studio, but I'm not going to do it as an autobiography that the artist has to narrate of how he started practice from his childhood and then started making art when he grew up and then went to some art school. I'm going to narrate that quick chronology myself so that we can get into the meat of the questions. So, Muhannad, friends call him Shono, was born in 1977. He grew up in Riyadh. He studied architecture in Khobar, the eastern coast of the kingdom. Growing up, he was always into comics and graphic novels. He was also making them. Somewhere along the way, his work was recognized and supported in order to create a graphic novel, which if you meet him in one-on-one, he can show it to you. He moved to Dubai in 2004 and stayed there until 2007 and went into advertising. Between 2007 and 2014, he was in Sydney continuing advertising, and the comic making continued. I don't know how many of you are aware of his comics and graphic novels. We'll see a few glimpses of them today. In 2015, Shono returns to Riyadh, to his mom's home. That becomes his studio. And he discovers a slow-cooking art scene here in 2015. He visits artist studios. He gets to do a mural at Athar, a gallery which you can actually visit over here. He meets Ayman Yusri, who's in our edition of the Biennale. He meets Ahmed. He meets many other artists who he makes friends with and discovers a whole community here. 2016 and 17, he's in Zurich and in Berlin, making art and testing robotics, which then gets supported by ITRA to develop it further. He returns to Riyadh in 2019 after these residencies, back in his mom's place, which is the studio. That's where he brings on board Arthur Weber, who is with us hovering around like a satellite as well. The two of them continue working together for a long time, until today, in all kinds of strange ways. I won't get into that. During COVID, he was setting up a kind of space, and in 2022, he moves to Jacks here in this very studio. He had a stint in the studio when it was not formalized, and we might just speak a little bit about that. And he's got his own ideas about what Jacks could be. In 2025 is when the famously known dogs in the studio start coming in. Right now, they've gone for a long walk. Some of them will be back in a little bit. In 2026, he begins doing jiu-jitsu in the studio every morning at 8 a.m. And so the collider takes place with not just ideas and particles and cosmic waves, but also just bodies every morning, grappling each other and wrestling. So on that note, that's a quick view of Muhannad's practice as it is situated across different places. But our idea in the studio as a roving site, as a constellation, is really to think about not this as the only studio, but the wider infrastructures in which his projects are made. But before we go into that, I think it's important to understand what he thinks and describes of his practice right now. So, Shono, how would you describe your practice right here, right now, today?
Thank you, Sabih. Thank you, everybody, for being here. You know, the idea of practice is something that kind of creeps up on you as you advance in your career. When I was younger, the idea of, you know, describing my practice, being aware of my practice, wasn't something that kind of factored in that small inner personal world of creating, of the imagination, of the stuff that I borrow from today in my current practice. The idea of now, you know, this challenging experience of being aware and having to explain one's practice, one's work, one's process, diminishes a little bit that personal, small world and space of the imagination. So right now, my process and my practice is really very much a constant attempt to balance between that small personal kind of well where everything flows from and that external eye of the public, of the district, and also my eye, joining that critique of what my process, my personal world is creating. And that's something that is hard to avoid at this stage in my career, but something that I think impacts the way you work on the smaller scale. And so my fundamental focus at the moment is how to continue to practice without being aware of myself doing the thing I love.
A very convoluted answer, I must say, because it sounds like a feedback loop of your inner world and your outer world. So let's just stay in the outer world. We want to talk about infrastructure. Where are we right now? And who all work on a daily basis over here?
So this kind of grew, like you said. Arthur Weber was probably the first person who got a visit visa when that started to happen in Saudi. There's always one Estonian in every country in the world, and Arthur's from Estonia. So he's representing Estonia and Saudi.
Only one Estonian.
One is an Estonian represents Estonia in every country. It's a rule. So Arthur was the first. Of course, Arthur and I used to work in Sydney in advertising, and we quit the agency at the same time. So when I moved back here, Saudi was a difficult place to invite people to come to. There wasn't a tourist visa, there wasn't an opportunity. Even my cousins who live in Germany couldn't come and visit. It was very difficult. So when that changed and a visa started to appear, he was one of the first people I kind of tricked into moving to Saudi Arabia. And I've always experienced Saudi as a place where people depart. So it really kind of became very warm, this idea that people could come and stay and start to call this place home. So for that, I'm thankful for his friendship and his faith in an early stage of change. And of course, as we went along, like in the Venice Biennale, installing the work there, meeting Federico, who has a solo right now at Marwa al-Muqat's studio, and inviting him here for a residency, and then asking him to join the studio. This kind of growing family of people come and leave, and being able to formulate groups to work on projects that then disperse, and then they come back in a new formulation. This is kind of the way I've been liking to work.
Because we're all here, can you tell me what's going on where?
So over here is our messy, extraction room work area. Upstairs is kind of a little bit of a more private thinking space. But we transformed the space just this morning, like we were just finishing up some projects, things got shipped out. So the space is always kind of morphing. There's also spaces for other artists like Federico, like Arthur. We had Latifa al-Bukhari, she was here for a while. Before that, Haifa al-Gouez was here. So a lot of artists have kind of passed through, they've contributed, they've been involved, and then they've moved on to their next phase and their next chapters. So the space is also divided to allow for easy transformation and continuous evolution.
Thank you. I want to quickly just turn back time a little bit and understand the transition. So Muhannad used to work a lot on graphic novels and comics, and his sketchbook he once described was kind of like his studio. He would just walk around with it, and it was a constant kind of expression and testing of visual languages and things like that. But there was a transition that happened from making comics and graphic novels into immediately very large-scale installations. And I want to understand, what was the shift like? Because was the shift abrupt? Do you see this as a continuous kind of a movement from things you were imagining in 2D becoming 3D? Was it an abrupt cut? Was it easy transitioning into this? What prompted these transitions to happen?
experience early on was struggling with categorization. So doing comic books, I would take a comic book that I had self-published and I would step into a comic book shop in Berlin and try to convince the owner to put it on the shelf. And he or she would say, it's more of an art book. It's not really fitting the format of a comic. Then taking that same book to a gallery and being told it's actually a comic book. It's not really an art book. So struggling with output and figuring out on what category of the shelf should this creative expression sit. And I remember doing, the mural you mentioned in Athar Gallery, and it was between Gallery 1 and 2 and the staircase. And Ayman Yusri Duban had a retrospective unfolding in all galleries. And I did this, massive mural all across the staircase, and I was standing there hoping to meet important people in the art world. And I realized I was standing in a transitional space between two categories, and that people in that moment were not ready to communicate with something that did not sit in a category they recognized. So it was that moment when I thought it was time to try to step into what I perceived at the time was a very forgiving space of contemporary art, where you could experiment, express that multidisciplinary interest, which I'm sure we'll speak of, and kind of do things that are not detrimental. We're not building bridges or something more serious, but it became a space for experimentation, and that became in the early stages very exciting.
You've also described how in kind of building your studio, even if it was in your mom's home, you'd always had people coming over. So 2 questions. How did your mom react to making her home your studio? And how did your friends react coming to your mom's home?
My mom insisted everybody should learn how to knit. So she was giving very intensive knitting classes to everyone, and so that was the experience.
You ever knitted?
Me?
Yeah.
Honestly, every time I'm producing a work, sculpting or working, I feel like I'm conjuring up my mother. Like she's working with the black material. Often I'm working and I'm feeling like my mom's making a kibbeh. You know what I mean? Like there's a project coming up in 2027 where I've sat down with her and she's been mapping a garden she grew up in when she was younger, and it echoes a lot of the drawings I'm doing here with these unfolding landscapes. So there's a beautiful kind of inherited connection, and it was very exciting. My mom had retired at the time, so to kind of bring friends and energy and creativity and have her involved in it was very nice, yes.
Did you confide in her and tell her at some point that, Mom, I think I'm going to become an artist?
I mean, my mom knew from the beginning. I used to, art and comic books and narratives was a form of escape. I couldn't come to terms with the way the narrative was unfolding in Saudi at the time growing up, and I felt very much isolated. So there was an incredible refuge within my mind, within stories, and that kind of space that I really valued, and only now am I really appreciating what comes back when you hold on to your imagination for long enough, when you honor the younger child in you, and how that imagination can then escape the mind and change the world around you. So I'm one of the reasons why I continue to push today with the studio and my friends is to honor that younger person who persisted.
So clearly you've had friends and a space of familiarity when you're working in your mom's home as your studio. But when Muhannad was in Berlin and in Zurich, in all of these kinds of residencies that he was doing, a very different crowd of people would start coming in because he started collaborating with a lot of scientists and engineers who were into robotics. How did you find these people, and what was the relationship of them coming in were they collaborators? What was that period like?
I mean, it started with college. So college, I did architecture, which I never thought I'd be interested in. But in comics, to tell a story, you need to be able to visualize a context, often a city or an environment. So the ability to bring to life the stage of a story became very important. I wanted to go to the US and study sequential storytelling, but that didn't work out financially for the family. So I ended up going to Khobar and studying architecture. And I realized that it was another form of creative problem solving, how to breathe life into a concept. So that idea again of the struggling with categorization continued as I started to step out into contemporary space and realized that I always felt like I couldn't have a loyal connection with the material. I needed something, a material, even the earth, that has gone through an unnatural experience, like the way I felt my growing up unfolded. Similarly with multidisciplinary or mixing categories, whether it was microbiology or robotics, bringing all those kinds of experiences and being able to realize that you can sit down with somebody who is completely engrossed in research in the sciences, but finding your presence as a breath of fresh air that is this creative, that childhood wondering of what else can be realized. And that was a fantastic moment where everything started to collide together.
And it's interesting because the scientists coming, Muhannad once shared with me, found it as a space that was quite liberating. They weren't confined by a lot of the questions maybe that were being asked in laboratories and institutional spaces. Why was it liberating in your studio?
Well, in Zurich, in the microbiology lab, they placed me in a glass studio in the middle of the lab, like a fishbowl. And a lot of the scientists would step into the studio, and I wanted to hear about their work. And for them, it was more of an experience of them wanting therapy, because they had been studying the cell membrane. That was the space. They've been studying the cell membrane of a certain bacteria and how it reacts to this sort of temperature for 6 years. And at some point, they're questioning what is the value of what they're doing, what they've sacrificed to realize. And they would say things like, "You're doing art, it's important, we're just figuring out bacteria." And that, of course, was very crazy to hear. So what we ended up doing was dealing with their concepts and visualizing them as a sculptural microbiome and connecting the different researchers and how one's work impacted the work and research of another, and created this sort of an idea, emotional mind map, connecting all their work and trying to show how their research has led to multiple other outcomes.
Just out of also the interest of time, I want to get back to some of your works and projects that you've made. And if you followed Muhannad's work, they often take on very large-scale installations. They're still preoccupied with black, the color black. Various kinds of experiences come through. It looks like charred earth sometimes. It looks like soot. It looks like something that you're exploring, which you're not quite sure of even sometimes. And I wanted to understand, maybe because also many other people might have that question, why black? What's your obsession?
It's not because I'm emo. I'm not. It's experiencing censorship and redaction from an early stage. Of course, my interest in narrative and comics and books, whatever little books was coming through into the library or the bookshop in Saudi, often pages were redacted. And that unexpected collaboration between the original creator of the book and the censorship mindset created something that doesn't exist anywhere. And even the original creator of the book doesn't know that their story is being manipulated in such a way. And this blackness did not act as a limiter of the story, but a highlight. It drew my attention to what was it that was so scary, what were they afraid of? And I remember holding the black ink up to the light to try to see what was taken away. And all it did was it highlighted and heightened my imagination. I had to solve the puzzle. So that encounter with the black mark became this kind of obsessive moment that I'm trying to recreate. When I introduce you to an installation that is of that pigment, this kind of large work, I'm trying to disrupt your entrenched narrative and introduce you to portals, gateways, and pathways towards transformative space.
It's very interesting because in Shono's work, and I'll describe a little bit about another artist in the Biennale, Ayman Yosri, but in the conversation with Shono about his obsession with the color black, the black doesn't become a site of erasure, but a site of projection. You're projecting into black all kinds of things that you want to see, or that you're asked not to see, and then you start obsessing over that and projecting that into the space. So very interesting that way. And we have Ayman Yosri's work in B3, in a collective observation gallery of the Biennale, where you also see various cinema posters redacted, cut out, you don't see faces in them. And it's very interesting because you kind of start thinking that there's a generation of people who would have seen what those posters were, and they're able to see the faces, or they still have it imprinted in their minds, and then another generation that has no idea of what those faces are that got redacted or that were erased. And these are not censored per se. Some of them are just basically changing social permissibilities. So people themselves just obliterating images. And then these obliterations become sites of all kinds of projections, cultural paranoias, cultural fantasies, all happening. Clearly, you're really interested in kind of sci-fi type fantasies of very large scale. Can you tell us one of your most ambitious works and where it was made, how it was made? Maybe your Venice work?
Yeah, Venice was definitely one of the first ambitious projects. You know, and Venice is coming up now, so this is a nice, I was the first to do it with the Visual Arts Commission. And it was also at a time when I had a very bad back injury and couldn't walk. So when they selected me, they asked me actually to fly to Venice to see the pavilion in one day because it was going to close for deinstall and I wouldn't see it until install. And I couldn't walk when they asked me to do it. I forced myself with a cane. I went to Venice. By the time I came back, I had worsened my situation. But I kept it as a secret because I was insecure. And a lot of things that have happened to me in my life that, you know, the more harder things in life have stemmed from a sense of moments of loss of confidence, that I couldn't tell them that I couldn't walk. Would they take away this opportunity from me? So I kept it a secret. All the Zoom calls, all the meetings where my camera was off. And I was very close to doing surgery. It was at that time that I turned to my community of friends, Saudi artists, young Saudi artists, artists from overseas that I had met previously on installations. And they had come together around this idea. They would come to my room where I couldn't stand up and I would sketch on the wall what I was thinking. And then they would start to visualize and model. And it was a very touching experience to share your inner world and trust in others.
But it was something that you actually occupied the studio here without actually officially signing documents. Is it somewhere up ahead?
Yes, so prior to DBF being the custodian of the Jacks district, this warehouse.
There we go.
Yeah, here. So the warehouse was empty. And it wasn't my studio. This is exactly the warehouse we're sitting in today. And it was really nice to work with those who were in charge, the Ministry of Culture, who were in charge of the spaces, and to be able to enter the space and work without paperwork, without NDAs, without insurance, without a contract, and kind of work in this very trusting, organic manner. And it's something that we should be cognizant of, that we are a bit losing it as things start to become paper heavy, formalized and limited in what can occur. Something like this wouldn't have happened at the time. This is one of the reasons why I then decided to move to Jacks, is that initial trust in people and what they allowed us to work.
Where are these sourced from?
These are from local farms around Diriyah.
So how does a process like this work? You're moving around, researching, finding spaces which provide this. This is also coming from various drawings you're doing. And you're in conversations with a bunch of people that include some of our colleagues in the Biennale too.
Yeah.
A shout out to Elena Bongiorno.
Elena.
Who's on the curatorial team. She helped in developing this project. But how does a work like this come together? And I know you were testing many things on this site, but you were also
so there were
many other sites.
Many collaborators. So of course the Venice Biennale, the teaching tree, was a structure of a living imagination. So it was breathing. So within that skeleton there was a breathing mechanism. So I was working with, again, the humanoid robotics team from Berlin that I had met, when I was doing my residency there. And they came together to work on this. We worked with a robotics person who works with NASA from New York, as well as We Exhibit, who constructed the structure with Elena. And actually, this is how I met Federico. He was part of the install team in Venice. And again, the team from here, starting here, collecting the materials, experimenting, doing prototypes that then were emulated in Venice. All this was really a big part of this new way of seeing how things can be realized, not within that personal inner space, but within a wider, permeable space.
And now that this work did get created and shown in this enormous scale, where is it now? And in what form does it exist? Is it somewhere here?
No, it's actually been acquired, and it's going to the Qasim Regional Museum, and we're going to install it at the end of this year again.
And what else do you do with a lot of your large-scale works? Do they dismantle and then reassemble somewhere else as another exhibition, or disappear until they're summoned again?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these become concepts. Like the work in El Mela's house with the threads. That work was very site-specific, So there's a lot of learning happening about how to work, how to make large works. And it's become very difficult, actually, to go back and do smaller, thoughtful drawings or sculptures. That's become more intimidating to me now than a large architectural scaled project, because you can hide behind the process when you do a large project, but when you're facing the page or the object alone in that intimate small space, that is something where we go back to the beginning and saying, what is my process today? It is trying to honor and going back to that smaller way of connecting with work.
Something interesting we realize as we visited many studios in Jacks is that the Diriyah Biennale Foundation and Jacks generally has been very generous in providing entire warehouses to artists to make it their studios. And it's interesting that a recent survey that was being done by DBF of the Jacks studios kind of revealed that with most artists, there were spaces in which they considered it as a studio, but everyone was having some relationship with hospitality, inviting people. Someone's studio is famous for its coffees, another studio is famous for its library, or just a place to chill and hang out. So we also discovered that actually the entire warehouse might not be the studio. In some instances it becomes a studio, in others it kind of contracts, and the studio sort of takes its own site within as a subset, while the rest of the studio space is then made into an exhibition space, a storage space, all of these kinds of things. So you see the studio space here in Jacks as a constant permutation and combination of various utilities and various occupants as well. In some cases, they become collaborators. In some cases, they just become almost like tenants. I don't think anyone's allowed to sublet, right?
Officially, no.
Officially,
no.
no.
No
Okay,
comment.
so no one's allowed to sublet a studio. Who knows what's going on in the back end? I'm going to ask my last question and then open it to the audience as to what is your dream studio?
My dream studio is a place where it experiences longevity and something that becomes robust and can outlive this very brief moment of cultural spend we're experiencing here in Saudi. So how to capitalize on what was generously invested, how to honor that investment, but fundamentally localizing ways of working, knowledge around materiality, trust in people, a place that becomes a home where people can stay and not depart. So the idea of longevity is important, not legacy. That doesn't mean anything. It is the idea of seeing Federico doing a solo today and seeing Archer thrive and artists move on to their exciting new chapters. So it's about sharing that experience and about lasting, not about being a moment. Don't quote me, I mean, if next year I'm not here.
But I think this question of longevity that Shono is talking about, which many other artists that I've had conversations with also mention, comes with a sense of a milieu also. And a milieu or so-called community of artists, practitioners, thinkers. And it's really interesting because this interest in developing a milieu is something that has to be nourished by everyone together. You can't just do it on a one-on-one basis. And when I was involved with the Shanghai Biennale almost 10 years ago, we would do studio visits for across many cities in across many cities in mainland China. And it was very interesting because you go to an artist studio and oftentimes a lot of young, still coming into their own kind of established, recognized kind of names. You go to one studio, actually the artist who's just shown you their work and their portfolio doesn't let you go without giving you a small memory stick of check out a few other artists' works, their friends or their people that they followed. And it became a very interesting instance because it was almost like, even if you don't select me, you might select someone I know in the city. And this kind of keeping a tenuous kind of thread of connections while one's obviously competing in an environment of scarcity, but there's also a certain level of generosity that one of us might just make it into some curatorial project elsewhere. And that seemed like a very nourishing kind of a space. And I think we're in a time in Riyadh especially where there's a booming of infrastructure. I wouldn't say it's a booming of art because art has been happening. There have been many artists living here, practicing here for generations, and some of whom we've had the privilege of working in the Biennale. But this boom in infrastructure can sometimes create a sense of scale is the only way to go, but there's so many other kinds of intimate connections that are also between art practices, and you can see one nourishing the other. The number of artists that are in this space with Shono then ending up showing in Marwa studio, that the exhibitions I think open today, right? Right now. So one artist showing another work, another artist, one artist giving a sense of space or a sense of refuge to work together. And this kind of an ecosystem developing is not a top-down ecosystem. It's created sort of like ground up. So that's been a very, very interesting thing to observe. I'm going to stop here because we have only 15 minutes left and we have quite a few other programs and talks lined up. Any questions? Anything you want to say before we open? No? We'll come back to you. Any questions for Muhannad?
Hi Muhannad, I'm Nawaf Tamim. I have a question about work that was commissioned by the GAM Museum in Torino, Italy. It was called The Caliph Who Seeks Asylum, right? So I was lucky to see it and sit with the art curator at the GAM Museum, and we talked about it, and there was a challenge that happened before the opening day where everything fell.
Yeah.
So I want to hear about your experience during that installation.
We were installing at GAM in the sculptural garden, and the whole time we were working with a team, and there was a glass mirror room where workshops were being held. And they were mirroring what the artist was doing. So I was working with PVC pipes. So they were giving workshops to kids working with PVC pipes, trying to emulate what we were doing, copying how we were bending the pipes. And at some point, the entire structure collapsed a day before the opening. And it was a massive panic. It's the one after this. You'll see here. This one completely collapsed, and that was the workshop room, which you couldn't see in, so I didn't know what they were doing. They were kind of watching and copying and watching, and then when this collapsed, they all ran out, the teachers, the instructors, the kids, and they helped us rebuild the structure.
You. Any other questions?
Hello, hi. Thank you so much, Shono, for your vulnerability also as you were engaging with Sabih on these questions of approaching the page. And I'm curious to hear from you if that is something that you've been ideating about confronting moving forward. I mean, I do acknowledge that, you know, you've had these larger installations in the past year, and obviously also being our last artistic director, co-artistic director amongst for the Islamic Arts Biennale as well. So it's beautiful to think about how, you know, something's quite fragile or small, or, you know, a drawing can feel like the biggest challenge, and how you're looking to confront it or not.
I mean, it was very easy when I was younger. You know, that was the studio then. It was my whole world. It was intimate, it was simple, it was the page, it was the line, it was the black mark. And I think one thing that happens as you go through your career, you're always drinking from that well that you had filled when you were younger, that thing that creates that obsession, that focus, that drive. And today, like I said, it's about finding balance and being able to honor that investment, that nourishing well, and not losing the thing that made you, you know, obsess when you were younger. So this is something that's very important for me now, is to not return to, because I don't think there's such a thing as returning and emulating the past, but reconnecting a string that I had cut and connecting it to see what it unfolds to in the future.
Any other questions? I have one very pressing question, if you don't mind, Marilu, just if I may ask very quickly. Why did you start doing jiu-jitsu in your studio? And what has changed since you started doing jiu-jitsu with other colleagues in the studio?
Less aggression, so you kind of unleash in the studio. No, it's something I used to do a lot. I used to travel and do it, and then of course the reality of a back injury and, you know, just aging, and it's been a pleasure now to be able to go back and do it with, you know, comrades in the studio, and I hope it could continue, because I think it's a beautiful practice, you know, personally.
Thank you. There's another sign, but I'll hold it until Marilu asks a question.
Thank you very much for this conversation, and thank you for presenting also the different people who live and work with you in this place. You've made the choice to also have animals in your studio who live where you work. So how did you come there, and what is their own role and their own part in your work?
I think it's a, you know, feeling like the studio is not an office, it's a home, and this idea of like making space for other things and being able to kind of coexist. Can you work, can you create and share a space with animals? You know, there's a big problem with dogs in the city here. You can see them, they're quite neglected, and they're, so, you know, we're doing our best. We're working with a shelter with Juman Roth. She has a fantastic shelter program, so if anybody wants a dog, hit me up, or a cat, we have a surplus. So it's really about that colliding between people and animals and work and multidisciplinary to the fullest.
Thank you, Marilu. That was my question about all the animals here. I must confess one thing, though, that I do sometimes have a feeling of resistance when people want to associate intimacy with home. The studio can be not a home and yet a space for intimacy, yet a space for coming together and things. And so the modality of the home creates this kind of a teleology of something you can go back to. But the studio is also moving in every direction. It's not a moving back to home. It's not necessarily a place of of homeliness, but also a place of unhomeliness, of the strange, and feeling estranged. And just wanted to say that. And I know that in all of the conversations, you've actually never used the word home. And today, I don't know why you've decided.
It came up, yeah.
Okay, yes, we have a question here.
Hello, thank you so much. It's been such an incredible speech to go into the details. I'm Yasmin Fikak. My question is more relevant to the materiality of what you're working on, because by time you keep on kind of investigating different materials. But I want to know, what was the link for you? What is the fabric that's linking them all? And what are you looking forward to dive deep into?
I think, because I'm Saudi, but I'm naturalized. So my parents are originally from Syria and originally from southern Russia on both parents' sides. So the idea of what material speaks to me naturally was an issue. What can I lean onto this earth, but I don't have a story connected with this earth. So how do I relate to it? So the idea of natural materials that have gone through a industrial, unnatural process spoke to me and became something that I kind of echoed myself in my stories, working with materials that have gone through. This black sand is from the foundry process. It's from a foundry in Jeddah. It's actually sand from Saudi Arabia, but it's coated in resin. It becomes black in the furnace. So it's gone through its own transformative, unnatural expression. So this is kind of what I gravitate to. Trying to be natural, but really understanding that I don't really fit in.
There's an interesting topology of black here that I've discovered while I'm spending more time. Recently, there's a museum of black gold that's open, and you can see something about nature and natural resources, meaning processing of nature, leading to some kind of arrival at the color black. And I mean, it's something I'm going to continue thinking about. Any other questions? Yes.
You speak about the personal a lot, and your work has this incredible quality, I think, of being very collective and very massive, monumental, but at the same time beautifully minimal and deeply personal. So whenever someone encounters your work, I think, or at least for me, when I see it, I think this work presents to me the most frightening questions that every person has regarding the world and themselves and maybe the relationship of both. And maybe this is also from an architectural background, because I'm an architect myself, and I think you can't be a very successful architect if you don't appreciate art, black art. There's this relationship between the artist and the work and then the viewer or the user in the case of architecture. And some architects have to let go of their work to the user, and some of them prefer not to see the users after they have delivered the work to them. And since your art is so deeply personal, is your relationship more with your art, or do you extend that relationship to whoever is encountering it as well? Do you wonder how they are encountering it and what questions they pose themselves, as opposed to the questions you posed yourself when you were creating it?
Sabih, you want to answer this? I mean, Sabih had a very interesting observation. The individual and the swarm, and how that relationship in my work, which is an interesting to observe and to think about. But I think I place myself as the singular encounter, but kind of with a rejection of singular narrative, the singular concept, the singular monolithic idea, and allowing things to fragment, to break out of the singular, and embrace the swarm, the collective, the many ways of seeing, how we reflect narratives, in the eyes of others and ourselves. So this kind of relationship between you as the one and that collective experience, that expanded space, that landscape of the granular becomes something very important and repeats again in the work. Why, I'm not sure, but I think it's a rejection of a singular story which represented the country in the past.
We can take one more question.
Speaking of the studio as a collider, we found out that you're interested in sci-fi and comics, and looking around the studio, we can see some gunpowder like figurines as well, and things other than the actual artwork being done. How do you think things that are outside the immediate work of making the artwork that you bring or other people bring into the studio impact each other and impact the art?
That's a great question, because we're all here together, we're in each other's face, we're speaking about our ideas, we're subliminally influencing each other, and the space becomes a place of generosity, so that you understand how you infect others, you understand that you're sharing a certain finite library of materials and resources. So things that you are considering end up in someone else's artwork, and things you said inspire another body of work in another. And this kind of allowing for these collisions of different hopes and dreams and materials becomes a big part of the maturing with the space and being able to share a space not that is personal, hidden in your mind, but sharing it with others and allowing that to shape its own world.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're not going to take more questions now, but a big thank you to Muhannad. Round of applause. But also a very big thank you to the Diriyah Biennale Foundation. They've been an incredible host. The team, everyone here, you know who you are. A big round of applause for the DBF programs team. This edition of the Biennale is titled Fil Hilwa Tirhal, in interludes and transitions, and we're looking at the cycles of itinerancy, cycles of transformations that come with movement, come with change, and this kind of a feedback loop that happens. And it was a privilege for us on the curatorial team to put together this series of Unpacking the Studio, where the studio becomes this microcosm of these movements and changes that are cyclical and that actually help transform our own cities. So thank you all for joining us in this series, and we hope we'll continue the conversations with you. Have a good evening.